Hello, and welcome to our 11th house.
Welcome.
All right, we are here for our second to last house episode, which is pretty exciting. We've got the 10th house today.
Very important house.
Yes, yes. It's a big one, right? It's like at the top of the chart, so it's like super prominent, which, of course, when we dive into the topics, we can elaborate on. And it has to do with career a lot of the times. That's a big portion of our life. If you think we're supposed to be sleeping for 8 hours a day and we're supposed to be like at work for 8 hours a day, the I don't want to say typical lifestyle, but the pushed lifestyle, I don't know. That's like what, like a third of our lives were spent either sleeping or working.
hmm
So
hmm
it's a big one, which is crazy. I don't know. As an entrepreneur, I would like to fight that notion that we need to be working 8 hours a day. But
I
for right
also would
now,
like to fight that.
that's why I'm like, it's not really typical. It's just the narrative that people talk about.
And I feel like it fluctuates so much because some people have multiple jobs and they're working like, or they have the kinds of jobs where you just have long shifts and so they're working like 12 hours a day or something like that.
Yeah.
And then other people are lucky and then they only have to work like a couple hours a day or work from
Hmm.
home or something like that. It's a little easier. Not all work from home jobs are easier, but my job got a lot easier once I started working from home.
Yeah.
So not as much fun, but easier. So
For sure. I agree. So this house has a natural affiliation with the sign of Capricorn and therefore Saturn. And of course,
Mhm.
the next house we'll go into also would have an affiliation with Saturn because Saturn also rules Aquarius. So this side of Saturn is the more conservative side of Saturn, right? The more
Mhm.
ambitious side of Saturn. So,
Boss energy.
yes, CEO boss energy for
Yeah.
sure. And then also the 10th house is going to be our last angular house. So we talked about the first, fourth, seventh, and 10th being all angular houses. And those are just really sensitive points because, for the most part, we have our angles, the ascendant, descendant, MC, and IC in those houses. But go back and check out I think the fourth house episode is where we talked about it the most about
Mhm.
angular houses. And also, it'll be the opposite to the 10th, right? So in the fourth
Mhm.
house, we're talking about the IC, and directly across from the IC is the MC, which most commonly is associated with the 10th house, but in the system we use, the whole house sign system, it'll float. And so it can be in other houses,
Mhm.
which I think is really important to look at. My MC is in the ninth,
Mine's in
yours
the
is in the
11th.
11th. Yeah. Those houses come into play when we're talking about the 10th house for that specific person. And so it's really important to look at those things and then understand the difference between the MC and the 10th house because I do blend them together often. And by blending them together, I also blend together the house topics, right? But the predominant, maybe we'll do an episode on the angles. I don't know. It might be cool to go deeper into them
Mhm.
than just like house surface. But to me, the difference between the 10th house and the MC is the MC weighs heavily on your life's mission. And that doesn't have to be related to career. It could be a
Mhm.
mission where you're just, when I think mission work, right? You have your day to day life and your job and your career, but you're active in the church and you go off and do meaningful mission work to you, right? The MC speaks to that bigger purpose that you're leaning towards, like the causes that you want to be involved with or the things that you're working towards in life. Whereas the 10th house, um, as we'll talk about, is more career oriented. It's not always, your career isn't always going to be your purpose in life, right? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Maybe if we look at in our house system, where we have that floater, maybe charts with the MC in the 10th house have a more like career that's aligned with their life mission
Mhm.
versus one of us where we'll have a mission more in the ninth house, but we still have a career on the side, or a mission in the 11th house and still have a career on the side.
Mhm.
But that's how, very briefly, I separate the two as two separate entities. Okay, so yeah, let's move into topics. Like we said, the 10th house is like high noon, if you want to talk about it that way. And so it's like the most prominent thing in the chart in the sky. And so it being like center stage in the chart, it speaks to what you're putting out into the world, what's very publicly seen, your public life. When we think about public life, this can be like your reputation, your public standing, or how people view you. And I go back to what we talked about in the first house, like we come off as something to everyone, right? And whether that resonates with us or not, it just shows, and that's how we show up. I feel like the 10th house, we have a little more control over how we show up in the public light, but it's not always something that we can control completely. I don't know. It makes me almost makes me want to pull up Trump's chart, but I also don't want to. But what is Trump's 10th house? Because he definitely shows up as a person that's
Yeah.
maybe perceives himself differently than how he shows up.
They know he's a Gemini sun. Oh my God, his chart is wild. So his MC
Oh
is in
God, Pluto.
Taurus in the
Okay.
10th, and his Mercury is in the 12th house. And he's always,
Mm.
which is interesting to me, mainly because, okay, what he actually does speak about a lot, right? So he's Gemini, like he's got his Gemini sun, but a lot of what he speaks about is he's always projecting his stuff onto other people. So whatever it is, like he's actually
Mm.
doing, right? If he's done something bad, he'll accuse other people of those things. It's like secret, whatever he is keeping secret. It's almost like the way that he talks about it is to put that stuff on others so that he can
Mm.
say that stuff, but not like openly. And I think that too,
And his
even
Venus is in the 12th, so it's ruling the 10th house, what we can see publicly.
hmm. And even like with the 11th, with his Gemini being an 11th in whole signs and his sun being there, like that makes sense too, because his brand of politics is populism. It's like
Mm-hmm.
riling up groups of people. Like he has a very specific group of people that he's talking to, and he's always trying to get them on board with this stuff.
Yeah, totally.
Oh, that's a
So
really interesting chart. It's all like on one side for the most part. His moon is in Sagittarius.
it's a, oh yeah.
That's the only thing that's not on that side is his moon in Sagittarius. Everything else is like on one like diagonal side
So
of the
he's
chart.
very emotional and heated
Hmm.
when it comes to foreign affairs. I think I want to say like the other person, like other
Hmm.
countries
That's
and stuff,
true.
and that kind of shows. Yeah, that kind of shows. Whereas the rest of his chart is just under, not necessarily under the surface because a 12th and 11th is above the horizon, but it's in the part of the chart that's tucked away. Like, how do I say that? Internal versus outternal? No, I don't know.
External.
External, that too. But when it comes to his 10th house, it's Taurus. And so obviously we can't speak to how he necessarily feels about how he's coming off, how what his reputation is, but I feel like he may think that his reputation is one that's practical, down to earth, and
I think his reputation is very bullish, right?
mm-hmm.
Like he's literally that
Right.
he's a
So his
bully, but
perception
it's
versus what
very
we're
much,
seeing,
yeah. And so
yeah.
his perception, I think that people have of him is very much whether you view that as being like bully in a bad way or bully in a strong way, because I think
Mm-hmm.
that his supporters like that about him, right? And the people who
Right.
don't like him also, everybody sees him that way, but whether or not you view it as a good thing or a bad thing is going to depend on like your viewpoint of him. But I definitely think he has that very fixed
Fixed.
bullish like
Yes.
energy where it's just headed he knows like he's very much he knows what he believes or wants or whatever and
Going
he kind
for.
of gets just nobody is gonna nobody's gonna say anything about that. I don't know. Pluto being in his first in Leo is interesting. Like, I don't know. This
Yeah.
chart is wild. This is like a weird chart.
It
Like,
is
it
pretty
makes
crazy.
sense for sure.
With Pluto, because we're here, with Pluto in the first and also Mars, he definitely views himself, right? He
Mhm.
knows himself to be a person of power, a
Mm-hmm.
person who is willing to fight for whatever he believes in type deal.
Mm-hmm.
And being in Leo, it's very performative. After the assassination attempt, we have that picture that now that's going to be an
Mm-hmm.
iconic picture in the history books of him just like raising his fist. That's like fighting back and standing in your power. And that's how he's coming across in the first house.
And I think also with that Pluto in there, there is like a lot of rebirth of his image, right? In terms
Mm.
of the way people viewed him, I think in the 90s is very different to everything post 2016, right? Because before he was just like, he'd make cameos in like Home Alone or like these like movies or whatever, which also, having Leo as his first house is interesting there with his sun in Gemini. It's like he was doing that. He had his own reality show and people loved him because you're fired. Like
You're
he had like his
fired.
little like fucking catchphrase. And so I feel like he definitely,
Almost forgot about The Apprentice.
right? I think that like after 2016 though, like there was that was like a real death and like rebirth of like his image and the way that people viewed him because he no longer was this sort of like funny, oh, he's just like this like businessman and you may have liked him or not or liked The Apprentice. I watched The Apprentice like for I
Hmm.
think at least a season or something like that. So, but now I don't think that's how people view him. I don't think that anybody is ever going to remember him for that now. So like, I feel like he definitely has a sort of desire to be known in certain ways that
Mm.
drives him, right? That Leo to me has a lot of ego, for better or worse, right? And that sign and having it in your first house is, I think your perception or how you show up in the world is probably like important, right? It's like going to be like
Right.
important to him what his reputation is or how people are perceiving him. And so he's going to like really focus on that a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Hmm.
Mm.
So, yeah, your 10th house can speak to how you're showing up in the world, how people are perceiving you, your reputation, your outwardly visibleness, but also the manner in which you go about your public affairs, I think. Like we said, that bullishness versus the more endearing side of Taurus. I'll just put it at that. When we're talking about the public life in the 10th house and that affiliation with Saturn, it's this long term running perspective of the person. Like we said, many of us probably aren't going to remember The Apprentice after a while. So, factoring in all the things he's done in his life, there's things that will stand out more prominently
Hmm.
that will hold the ground or hold the place of the 10th house for the general public.
Hmm.
When we're talking about public reputation, we're also thinking about cases where your reputation is either held or projected or made known. So, like for me, I'm obviously not a politician, I'm not a person of any such power politically or worldly, but where my reputation has been shown to the public in the past has been like newspapers or radio articles. Like when I was swimming, I would get published in the paper or I'd have interviews. And so my public reputation is being either withheld or not. I remember one time I got misquoted in a newspaper and it was a big deal because it was like twisting of words, right? So
Mm,
the places where your reputation can either be put on a pedestal or maybe twisted and not
mhm,
conveyed the way you would like.
mhm.
Those are all 10th house places.
It's like your legacy because
Yes.
also this is like before careers, right? Astrology was invented before the idea of jobs and stuff was like a thing. So I think now people often think of their legacy as being their career just because we live in this capitalistic society and all that. But it can be more than that, right? So even like when we were talking about Trump, his legacy is not necessarily just like his career, not necessarily just the jobs he had, not even just being president, but what he did as president or the way that he communicated as president, like those kinds of things. I think that's more like what he'll be like known for than actually like the job itself that he did.
Yes, correct.
What do people remember you for? What is the thing that you're like leaving in the world, or like you're like the
Yeah.
mark that you're leaving on the world that you will be remembered for or not? So,
Yeah, absolutely. Like we said, not everyone has the career or the career doesn't always align with the mission, right? And then it makes me think of that quote, they won't always remember what they said, but they'll remember how you made them feel or
mm-hmm,
something like that. And that's the 10th house.
mm-hmm,
What's the taste in the mouth of the person that's like, when your name's
mm-hmm.
brought up? Oh, Kalia. And like, yeah, well, she's bullish. She's a Leo rising. She's bullish. Hopefully that's not true. Give me some time to build up my legacy. But yeah, what are you leaving behind?
hmm
What is your lineage that you are able to pass on? I guess the legacy would be passed on to the lineage, right? I use those words wrong, but same, same. And then going into the actual profession. So if we're talking about, nope, I just brain farted. You brought up like the ancient. I hate saying ancient because it makes it feel like so long ago. But some of these things are really long ago. Like obviously, I would
Astrology was
say
invented
astrology is
thousands of
pretty
years ago.
ancient.
So like, about, like, yeah.
But outside of modern society, we're talking
Mhm,
about legacies, right? What we're leaving behind, what we're known for. And versus modern society being
mhm,
that now is like, what did you accomplish in your career life? So that's where the career comes into play, like you pointed out. And this could be like what you've built. Oh, I went from zero to millionaire. I made this empire of whatever, the toilet paper company.
mhm.
Some of these things are just like, some of the examples that come to me in the moment are really weird.
I'm horrible at coming up with examples in the moment. Like in teaching, that was always a struggle for me. Like anytime I had to be like, oh, come up with a fake name, like an example name in the moment, like you're quoting an article, and I'm like, who wrote the article? It's always John Smith. I literally could never come up with another name in my mind. It was like the most basic name
Yeah.
ever, like the
Jane
most
Doe
like
and
just
John
like
Smith.
neutral like white dude name or whatever, or like the actual Johnson. But it was just literally every time I was like, no, I've got to come up with a different name this time. And every time it would be like the only name that would enter my brain was John Smith. And I was like,
Oh my gosh. So yeah, apparently my mind's like Kimberly Clark. I don't even know much about their company. That idea of rags to riches. I've built this
mm-hmm,
thing up to whatever it is, some sort of empire. There's that because it's not necessarily what you did for the company. It's just that you built it up, right? Whether or not you were the CEO or you literally worked as a janitor, it's that you built this thing, and the 10th house is the thing that people are going to remember you by. Who knows? Kimberly Clark, was that a person? I don't know. But we remember that name is associated with toiletries or toilet paper, like paper products.
mm-hmm,
That's the 10th house of the person, not
mm-hmm,
necessarily the career that they did within the company, right?
mm-hmm.
I guess that's what. Universe, you're fucking with me. Talk about Kimberly Clark. Okay.
Or okay, so as an example, like for my 10th house, right? For the most part, because I'm Sagittarian, Jupiter, like all that kind of stuff. For the most part, I'm a very big picture kind of a person. I don't really like to get
Mm,
bogged down with the little details, but Virgo is a very detail kind of sign, right? And the one area of life where I do tend to do very detailed work where I'm doing like line edits of papers and like making corrections and making things perfect and all that kind of stuff is my job, right? I'm an English professor. So a lot of the work I do is I'm reading people's papers, I'm like correcting them, I'm giving them like feedback on that to improve it. But also that like the way that I approach being a professor and also the feedback I've gotten from students in like my evaluations is often, oh, I'm like like the nicest English professor they've ever had or something like that. When I get positive feedback when my students like me. So they're like, oh, I'm like the nicest English professor they've ever had. Like I was so like helpful to them because if they had something happen that was like a traumatic event or they got ill or like these things that I was very like kind to them and gave them extensions, which is like the other thing of Virgo, right? I feel like of being like this, you want to do this sort
Mm,
of healing, or you want to be like very,
of
it's
service to
not
the
like a
person.
like detailed like this all the time. It's also just, yeah, trying to be of service and trying to be of service to like the community, because education to me is more than just, oh, the job I do, because I really believe that like it's important for us as citizens to have that opportunity to be educated. And in particular, I chose community college, not to teach at like university, because I want to serve people who are less likely to get that education, right? Because a lot of time, like community college students are students who didn't get the chance. They aren't traditional students. They didn't go straight from high school to college, or they didn't have the money to do this, or they're first generation students, or like there's a lot of different things that play with community college students. They're like working full-time jobs a lot of the time. I did too, because I was also a community college student, but it was like a mission in that way too, and a mission to improve things in the world by exposing them to like certain ideas. Like I in my literature classes do a lot of like philosophy in things that I think that they aren't exposed to, because I've worked in a lot of like after I left Washington, the other two colleges I've primarily taught at were in pretty like conservative areas. And I know there's the stereotype of, oh, the liberal college professor
Hillary
trying to
Swank.
indoctrinate our kids, right? But I genuinely don't believe in doing that. I don't want to try to make my students like more progressive, or that's not really what I'm doing. But what I do believe in doing is educating them on like the actual things that they're talking about. So
Right.
I'll have them read critical race theory or Marxist theory, and I don't tell them, hey, like these things are true or you need to believe them or anything like that. I'm like, you can totally disagree with it. I don't care if you believe in it. I just want you to read it so you actually understand what it is, because a lot of these things are like fearful talking points that like they think incorrectly about what this actually is doing, right?
Mm,
And so I'm just trying to expose them to these ideas, because I'm hopeful that at least if they have critical thinking skills, at least if they like understand these concepts, they won't be so afraid of it when they go out into the world. They're not going to be so afraid of the other, or so afraid of ideas that are unknown to them, or that they've been told are bad, that they'll actually like for themselves at least be able to reach some kind of conclusion about it that's educated. And I think that all of those things make a lot of sense for like my 10th house being in Virgo, because like the way that I approach my career, I think is very different from like other aspects of my life, where I'm a lot more like, I don't want to do details. I don't want to get bogged down by all this stuff. And also that the other thing that I really career wise have been interested in or done stuff with is publishing, which is also very Virgo in that it's also very detailed in my own way, that I have to get bogged down in character creation or like edits of my own work and things like that. But also because it's a Mercury ruled sign. And so
hmm
it's like very much when my Mercury is in my first house. So a lot of the stuff that I like to write about is personal to me. I'm writing about stuff in a fictional way that I am thinking about internally that has to do with myself, or things that I want in my life, or things like that. So I think that you can really look at your 10th house and like the sign that's ruling it, the like planet that rules that sign, like all these different things, and think about it and like how that shows up, not necessarily in the exact career, but maybe like the way you approach your career, or the way that you feel about your career, the things you want from your career, because that's like the legacy part of that, not just the day-to-day job, which would be sixth house, or the way that you're making money, which is like more like second house, like that these things are like, and for fire signs, it's all going to be earth stuff, which is like really
hmm
interesting. Like
Yeah.
fire risings are all going to have these like earth placements for their career. So it might be like the one area that they're pretty like detailed or driven by or something, whereas other parts of their life maybe a little bit less. But
Yeah, definitely. Because I'm never as organized as I am in an office job, like a public office
mhm.
job. And I'm very fixed in that way. So I'm Taurus. I'm very fixed and no, it has to also bring in that Venusian. So it has to look nice. It has to feel nice. It has to be more of a luxurious atmosphere for me to get my work done. And I don't mean luxurious like I need $1 million office chair or whatever. I just need like it to feel clean and put together, right?
Mhm.
But if you move the camera around and look at my office now, which is at home, home is ruled by Mars and Scorpio. And it's like, woo, even though
Mhm.
this is, supposed to be my workspace.
That's funny because you said that, and I'm like, what is mine? Because my home is very Pisces, and I'm like, oh yeah, my stuff, like the stuff behind my desk, I have a whole wall that's just covered in art that I like, and very like I have a thing with all the moon phases or this art that's very fantastical and sensual, or like stuff that like my girlfriend drew for me, stuff like
Yeah.
that. So it's very, I guess my office space, it is very different than the office space I had when I was like had my office like at work, because that I tried to keep very like, here's all the books that I've read and here's all my
Yeah.
professional stuff. This is a lot more, here's stuff I like to look at during the day that makes me happy. Like,
Which brings in those angular things, right?
mm-hmm,
Especially for people like us who are predominantly working from home. There's
mm-hmm,
that opposition of where do you find the balance between home, what makes you feel happy, secure, safe, and
mm-hmm,
what helps you 10th house be productive in the outer worlds.
mm-hmm,
So, like, where do you find that balance on that spectrum? Versus when you have an office outside of the completely detached from the home, that opposition comes into play as like how much time are you spending at home versus how much time are you spending at
mm-hmm,
work. And then those two places look very different because they're not
mm-hmm.
physically attached to each other, right? If my old boss came in and saw that I was working in here, he'd lose his mind because he sees me in the Taurus. He sees me in the
Right.
Taurus. He would always compliment how nice my office was, right? Also because his office was not the most organized or pretty, but like
Mm-hmm,
very different spaces and therefore very different approaches to that
mm-hmm,
area of life.
mm-hmm. And I know somebody who has like a 10th house that's Cancer. And that one, for examples of like different kinds of careers, she did a lot of jobs that were related to taking care of other people, right? In
Mm,
like education and the medical field, things like that, where she's just, but not the positions of doctor, say, or like the teacher. It's more like the things of actually taking care of the patients or the students or things like that, helping them. Like that was more like the kind of role, but now also works from home, right? And so like Cancer is also very much associated with the
yeah.
home. So like there's like a lot of different interesting things that I think can be looked at when you're like looking at your 10th house for what do you really want to be, what do you want to be remembered for? And then that can come into place with other stuff depending on what your chart looks like. But the 10th house is how you're approaching that. How are you approaching how you want to be remembered, your legacy.
Mhm. Mhm. So going back to this like angular house and how they all play in on each other, we talked about in the fourth house, it could be a parent. And depending on what astrologer you're talking to, will have a different idea. Some people will say the fourth house is mom and the 10th house is dad. And some people will be adamant that the fourth house is dad and the 10th house is mom. For me, I have definitely seen examples that are convincing enough for both ends of the spectrum. And so at this point in my journey, the fourth and 10th can obviously speak to parents, and it's up to the native to decide which parent it predominantly shows in which house. And those can change depending on the rules and how the family dynamics change because my mom was always the breadwinner and always out doing the career ambitious Capricornian
Mm-hmm.
thing. And so for me, most of my life, my mom would have been featured in the 10th house and my dad was at home and like taught us the more like nurtury things because he was around more, so he would be more fourth house for me for most of my life. And then
Mm-hmm.
now it's switched. Obviously, dad's gone, so mom plays more of that nurtury, more fourth housey feel. And
Mm-hmm.
she's also retired, so she's not working anymore. So her roles in the public realm have changed, right? But going back to this opposition, if we've decided that a parent is playing a role of a fourth house parent at some point in time, then there's this natural gravitation towards there's always going to be like a good cop bad cop or a mom dad figure
Mm-hmm.
in life. And all families look different. I don't mean there's always going to be a mom and a dad. I mean that there's some place you're going to pick up your nurturing side of things,
Mm-hmm.
and there's some place, whether that be like a teacher or a mentor, somebody outside the home, you're always going to find a role model or a mentor that shows you a more of a masculine role. And I don't mean masculine as gender specific, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
like more of an outgoing, ambitious example.
Mm-hmm.
So the dynamics we see in the home with whatever parent is in the fourth house, or however we see the roles of the superiors of our home, right? The people in charge and our early home life will be mirrored, because we're looking at an opposition, will be mirrored into the 10th house. So many ideas are floating, it's hard to articulate. Because I was like, oh, we can see it in the 6th house, like when we come to, because like 3rd and 6th, they're squared. So the dynamics we see in our siblings, 3rd house, are going to play at some point into our 6th house with coworkers and like people we are surrounded around more in our daily
Mm-hmm.
lives. And so that's the same kind of, it's not a square, it's an opposition. So the things that we've come from, our home family life, are going to somehow play out in the career sector or the public life sector. Sometimes you'll have unresolved issues with a parent or an early childhood authority figure that might play out in the themes you have with your bosses. Like maybe you couldn't communicate.
That for sure has been true for me.
Yeah, okay. I'm like, how do I articulate this
I
point
am
across?
I am terrified of my bosses. Like even out any kind of authority figure, right? I swear every time my boss has ever called me, oh, we have to have a meeting or anything like that. Any
Mm,
boss, and it doesn't have to be a man, right? Although this is definitely stemming from like my issues with my dad. I am always afraid I'm going to get fired. And then I'll go up. I remember my dean, like when I first started working at my college, the first year, there were a couple times where we had to have meetings and she would tell me, okay, we're going to have a meeting today or something. And the whole day I would be anxious and freaking out. And I'm like, oh my God, this is the day that they're going to tell me we shouldn't have hired you or you're not like as good as
mm,
we thought you were, like whatever. And I always am like terrified. And then it'd be like, no, you're doing great. Everybody loves you, blah, blah, blah. And but even then, no matter how many times I've been told that, I'll still have anxiety about it because I'm
yeah.
always worried my boss is gonna fire me no matter like how I've been doing or whatever. I always feel like I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing good enough to impress my bosses and that they're gonna fire me. And then when there have been negative conversations with bosses, I've cried before because like later, not in like the meeting with my boss, but like later I'll cry. So I definitely think that's true.
Yeah. It goes back on those angular things. Like the fourth house is so fundamental and so foundational to
Mhm.
how we learn how to be a human, that when we move to the next angular houses at square, our 7th house is a partnership. So things that we learn from our parents' dynamics, or like dealing with the parents, we bring into our relationships. And if we don't solve them in our relationships, we move to the next angular houses and we bring it into our careers. And then like it just goes around the angular circle in those really sensitive parts of the first,
Mhm.
fourth, 7th, and 10th. And it all relies back on the first, how do we feel as a human compared to where how we were brought up in the fourth house, like our home dynamics. It's just that awareness piece that other areas of your chart will play a part. So, parents and people in authority, and that can show up in your career or that can show up in other public spaces, right? Because it's not always going to be the career.
I really wish I had my dad's birth time because I know his chart in terms of the planets, right? So I can do synastry with my chart. Like I can see where his planets fall in my chart. But I really wish I knew his rising sign because I'm so curious sometimes as to like what. But I was just thinking about that because I was looking at like my dad's planets and I was like, what's interesting about my dad and my career is that he has so many planets in Leo. Like he literally has a sun, his moon, his Mercury, his Venus, his Saturn, and his Pluto in Leo. But he also has his Jupiter and his Chiron in Virgo. And one thing that I will say about my dad and I's relationship that was interesting, because my moon is also in Leo. And one of the things I've said before, and I think I said this like when we did like probably the ninth house episode, because that's where it's at, is that a lot of the validation I get comes from like my academic success, right? Comes from, oh, like I did this thing. And so I get a lot of validation. But that started in like my childhood largely with my dad. And that like the way that like my dad viewed me he was the one who I think even more so than my mom really wanted me to go to college. Like he really wanted me to get an education. And I remember like being afraid sometimes because like he threatened to send me to military school one time. So I had to fake my report card because I was so afraid that if I didn't get good enough grades, he was going to do that, which I don't think was ever going to happen. Like it's not like my mom was going to let that, but he threatened that. So I thought it was true. So I was freaking out about it, right? So he put a lot of pressure on that and also was very supportive of it. One of the ways I could get my dad to be like okay with me or like where he would be like supportive of me and not mad at me but cheerlead for me or whatever was to get that education and was to have this career. Like he very much wanted me to have it. And it makes sense because he didn't really take advantage of that, didn't really get an education. He had opportunities too, and he always squandered them. And so I think that he really wanted me to do that. So it was really important for him. And with the synastry there, you can also look at how the parents show up in that house in terms of like how they feel about your career or what they like do on that, like with the home or career or whatever, like how they might be an influence there.
I was just thinking, my dad also threatened to put me in military school. And I'm like, I wonder if that's in a chart somewhere.
Link, which is
uh,
wild because I was in middle school when this happened. I was in middle school. I'm pretty sure it was in the seventh grade. It would have either been the sixth or the seventh grade, but I'm thinking it was the seventh. And I remember that he did that, and I like had to complete like I went home on Word and did my actual report card, and I changed it just enough. I didn't try to pretend I had straight A's. I knew nobody was gonna buy that anyway, but I was like, because I was not a good student. I was not a good student until the second time I went to college. So not until my brain fully developed because I was like almost 25. But like before that, I was very much just, I want to hang out with my friends or I want to read or do whatever I want to do. I don't want to do homework. So I was a bad student, but I forget where I was going.
you changed your report card.
Oh, I changed my report card to avoid, I like went home and I'm on Word and I was like, okay, I got a D here. So I changed it like just enough to like meet these like requirements. And then I remember what happened is this my mom came to me, like I turned in my report card, everybody was happy, like whatever, I did better, supposedly. And my mom was like, oh, Rod was like, my stepdad was like looking at this and he calculated that actually you should have made like honor roll or something by being on the having this report card. Like we should contact the school and they get that to you. And I was like, no, I don't really care about stuff like that. I don't care about awards or which is not true at all. If I made
Yeah.
honor roll,
Yeah.
I would want recognition for that. I love recognition for my academic achievements. So I was like, no, I don't care about stuff like that. Don't worry about it. It's no big deal. Don't contact the school.
Oh my gosh. We're sorry, Mom. We're sorry.
Almost every time I hate lying, and I'm a bad liar too. Like I'm generally like not a very good liar, and maybe it's because I'm a Sagittarius and Sagittarius Mercury, and it shows on my face. Like I'm very much
Mm.
like even trying to keep surprises from people. I always want people to know I knew. Like I also messed that up with my mom too because I remember I think it was for her 50th birthday party. My stepdad invited all of her sisters down, but he didn't tell her. And I would go up to her. She'd be getting ready in the morning in the bathroom, and I was like, "Don't you just wish that your sisters could be here with you?" I'm horrible at lying, but every time I have really tried to lie, it was usually because I was trying to not be in trouble with my dad. That's what I
Mm.
learned. That's where I was like really actually trying to like successfully lie because I was afraid of what would happen to me if he found out whatever it was. It was never anything like really bad. I didn't really do much bad stuff as a kid, but it was always like this fear. And that's the only time I was good. Every other time it was just like me just being there, like trying to get away with something. And it was
Oh my
very much
gosh.
like I've been told, like my mom will be like, she'll say something right. She'll show me something. We'll be shopping. She'll show me like a like clothes, be like, hey, what do you think about this? And whatever I think about it immediately is like on my face. I can't like hide anything on my face. I cannot lie. I'm so bad at lying. The best I can do usually is to try to not talk about the thing that I don't want brought up or
Mm.
that I feel like I might have to lie about. I just try to avoid talking about it because if I do it all, it's gonna show up on my face. It's gonna show up in my body. I can't not do.
So yeah, going back to the Mercury thing, your 10th house is ruled by Mercury in your first house. So
Mm-hmm.
your outward appearance in both places, publicly
Mm-hmm.
and just like when people don't know you. But when people do know you, 10th house, it always is going to revert back to your physical appearance. Or Mercury's there also, just the way you speak about things or don't speak about things, publicly speak about things.
Hmm.
That's hilarious. Um, I'm trying to think of things about my chart. My Taurus 10th house is empty, but the ruler, Venus, is in the 5th house. And so I do feel like I've done those a lot of personal development assignments or work and stuff. And so a lot of times at some point in a program, it'll be like text 10 people and say,
Oh
ask them
God.
3 things that they know about you or 3 things that they appreciate about you. And I feel like that can be part of your reputation, like what people are thinking about you, right? What
Hmm.
people know you for. And a lot of the times, one of the words that comes up for me is creativity. So it goes
Hmm.
back to that Venus ruling from the 5th house of creativity. And then also, I've gotten a lot of, I don't know how people word it, but the idea of like simple truths, like simple practical truths, which is very Taurus to me, and also not something I think I resonate with. Like, all of our episodes have been at least an hour long. Tell me an hour is simple. I do not constrict myself down to something very concise, right? But
Hmm.
apparently that's how I come off. I come off as you have concise, practical advice or wisdom or some sort of thing which reflects in that Taurus energy, but not something I think that I possess.
Maybe it's because you're Mercury, like me,
Mm.
like you feel like you're not giving that energy, but other people are gonna see it that way. But it's
Oh, because Mercury's in the 7th?
yeah, and because it's like in Aquarius, which is not necessarily something that I would associate with being simple either, I feel.
Yeah.
And so maybe the simplicity though is like also just the simplicity in the language itself, or the simplicity in that it's like easy to that it's clear, because I think too like simple, and I like simple is not like a bad thing, because oftentimes one of the mistakes I'll see students make right in their papers is they try to sound smart by using
Mm.
thesaurus, right? But they don't really understand how to use the language to do that. And really all it ends up doing is making things sound more convoluted. Oftentimes when people try to sound smart or do all that kind of stuff, it's they're just doing language that's these big words because they feel like it makes them sound like they know more. Simple would be
Mm.
like you speak in a way that is like easy for people to understand, that it's not, there's not a lot of extra stuff attached to it that's not necessary. So it's not that like you're necessarily, maybe the Aquarius thing is you might go off in different directions, or it might be like long, we might talk about it for a really long time or talk about a lot of different things, but whatever we're talking about is done in a way that it's clear. There's like clarity. You're
Mm.
breaking stuff down, right? Like astrology is really complex, and trying to break it down into like simple terms that other people can understand, like who aren't getting like a degree in astrology, right?
Yeah. Okay. I feel good about that. Yeah, yeah. That sounds good. And it goes back on that square to the other angular houses. Like Mercury is going to have an effect on my 10th house because it's square by sign. There's nothing in the 10th house to be planet or a thing to be square to. But I also just like when we're talking about these houses, we're looking at what
Mhm.
things, what life areas are always going to be square, the other life areas. So by sign, my Mercury is square. I like that idea. I would love to be known for somebody who can rank complex things down into more digestible nuggets.
That's one of those skills that's like a very like underrated. It's all the soft skills, right? That people really undervalue, and they're like, oh,
Mm,
like why do you get a degree in communication or something? And that's what are you gonna do with that? And it's but a lot of times, even when I've had friends who like they deal with really complex things. They're talking to engineers and stuff like that. But part of the problem that they'll have is, oh, they can't figure out how to break that stuff down for lay people. And that's
mm,
really important when you're having to talk. Say, when I was like a social worker, being able to write notes that could be understood by the medical professionals and other social workers that I was working with, but also being able to talk to the residents and their family members and break down the stuff that like was happening for them was like important, right? You need to be able to talk to different groups of people, not just people who understand you. And so I think
Yeah.
that's one of those like really underrated skills, because if you have some kind of specialty knowledge, which most people, even if it's just a hobby, have some kind of specialty knowledge, right? That like when they're talking to other people, can they break that down for them in a way that the other person can understand, is very underrated.
Maybe I need to harness my Taurian energy a little bit more. This is the thing too. It was just a fleeting thought earlier on in the episode, and it doesn't really fit in, but apparently it fits in now. When you're looking at the dynamics in your chart and say, "Oh, my 10th house is empty. Yeah, I can fall back on the ruler in the 5th house. What does that mean?" But maybe you get stuck there. That doesn't mean your reputation just falls flat or it doesn't
Mhm.
like there's more to it. You're just not picking up on the things. Maybe you can pull in other aspects. We have every planet, every sign, every house in our chart. And say in my 10th house, I need to pull in my Mercury more, right? It's in the 7th house. So, how do I activate? How do I tune into my Mercury and activate my Mercury to be able to use it in the 10th house? And really, actually, that's a really good example that I'm now putting together is like my Mercury is in the 7th house of partnerships. So you and I are a partnership, but pulling our Mercury, my Mercury, out and putting it in the public eye with publishing this podcast, right? And
Mhm.
hopefully this podcast is just like one little stepping stone into the legacy, the empire, quote,
Mhm.
quote, quote. If you're not watching this, because I don't want to say I'm a big deal, like it's something that is going to be seen and recognized in the public eye, but yet I was able to pull on, draw from other parts of my chart to be able to do this thing. So I think that goes back to also if there are dynamics in the 4th house that you need to work through, maybe you're able to pull out the signifiers in your chart that you feel comfortable with, that you are good working with. Say your Venus is really well placed and high functioning, right? Maybe you
Mhm.
want to pull in your Venus to use the power of your Venus to work on your 4th house and clear some of those blockages so that you're able to reflect that in the 10th house in a way that's productive, right? You're not always going to see eye to eye with bosses or authority figures, whatever, in the 10th house. But if you're able to activate other parts of your chart to help with that, I think that would be beneficial.
Mhm.
Going back, reiterating the same thing we say every single episode, the chart is a
Mhm.
holistic, living document that we can use to our advantage.
Mhm.
Let's see. Anything more we want to say about that, or should we move on to perfections?
Yeah, move on to perfections.
Okay, so 10th house perfection years. So, perfections is an ancient Hellenistic timing technique that both Michelle and I use to look at what themes are going to be playing out for us at certain ages in our lives. Basically, what happens is when you turn a certain age on your birthday, that's activating one of your 12 houses, and therefore those themes are going to be predominant for you throughout that time of your life, that year. This is annual perfections. There's a way to perfect down to, say, the second, but annual perfections is the most clear and gives you enough time to really develop those patterns. And then we also have our grab and go astrology house insight guide called House Magic, and it'll have all the reference keywords and guides to help you start connecting the dots in your birth chart with the houses. And in that PDF that you can grab on our website or in the link below, has a perfection wheel. So basically, you just find the age you are or the age you're turning and see the corresponding house for that. So the 10th house perfection ages are, and because I've messed this up in the past, I'm going to look at the chart. So they're 9, 21, 33, 45, 57, 69, 81, and 93. So, do you have any good 10th house examples?
I do. So the first one, I don't, the only major event that I can remember from the third to fourth grade is that my best friend at the time stopped going to public school and started being homeschooled. And she was for like the
Mm.
next 3 years or so, which was like a death in the 10th house here, like the death tarot card in my, in my 10th house. But I don't know. It's like an interesting one because it's like, I don't know necessarily how that specifically is going to relate to the 10th house. But the other two have a much more like specific connection. So the next, the second 10th house year that I had back in 2008 was interestingly a chariot in the 10th house year. And that one was, I was going through a lot of different jobs at the time. So I had recently left like the one job and I went through about 3 jobs in this year. So I worked briefly at a hotel, like a very sketch hotel. And then for the beginning part of the year, and then in the middle part of the year, I worked on this cruise line that went back and forth between Washington and Canada and toured some islands in Washington and stuff like that. So I worked there, which both the hotel and the cruise line I think are interesting with the chariot because that's like travel, right? Like both of
Yeah.
those things are really like involved with travel. But I also personally did some travel. I went to Hawaii that year, but specifically the reason that I went to Hawaii was because for a really long time, because I remember the first time I did this was when I was in the 7th grade, the first time I went for this reason, because I've been to Hawaii for 3 times, and all 3 times have been related to my career in some way. Because the first 2 times are related to writing, and then the last time that I went was for a conference for academic stuff. This time, though, when I went, it was because I was writing this novel about Persephone and Hades. And so while I was working at the cruise line, I had a lot of downtime because basically my job was to do tickets and like reservations and stuff like that. So I was there a lot of the time where I was just after the initial like morning period where people would come get their tickets and get on the ferry. That was pretty much it, like until the end of the day. And so like I would spend a lot of time where I didn't really have to do much, or like I'd have these weird split shifts where I'd have a 4 hour break in between my like 2 shifts, right? And instead of leaving, because this is when I first discovered Fairhaven, right? Before this, so like I had like when I first moved to Washington, I was living in Oak Harbor, and then I moved to Bellingham, and then it was at this point when I first discovered the Fairhaven part of Bellingham, which is like my favorite part of Bellingham because I love all the little shops there and like the vibe of Fairhaven. So I would spend that split shift, like I walk around. I was doing the artist way book exercises, like doing the morning pages and all that kind of stuff. I was exercising. So I was doing like a specific like walking regimen. So I would walk around Fairhaven and do like I had a little blog, like a live journal that I was doing that was like called, I probably shouldn't say what it was called because I think it's still up, but like feel like I'm gonna find it and like all my old live journals. I have all these like old like fan fiction and live journal accounts, and so I was like writing like Phantom of the Opera fan fiction during this time because that's like my obsession. I love Phantom of the Opera. I loved it since kindergarten, and in high school and during this time, I was reading and writing now a lot of the fan fiction, and I was writing this book on Persephone and Hades, and the reason I went to Hawaii was for this writers conference. So back to the Hawaii thing. My uncle at the time, he had for a really long time, many years, I don't know how long, had run the Maui Writers Conference, which now doesn't exist, but like for a really long time did that. And so they would have like agents there. It was like a really big deal. Like it wasn't just like a small little writers conference like the one I used to go to in Bellingham. It was like a really big one. And I remember like they had Jack Canfield, the guy who did like the Chicken Soup for the Soul series, came, and they had Stephen King's band performed. So it was like a
Wow.
big deal. And so I went to talk to like agents about this book and all this kind of stuff that I was working on. So this year was like a lot of me figuring out, I think, what I wanted to do. This was before I had gone back to college. This was actually like probably a year before I would make the decision to apply to go back to college. So I wasn't really in that mindset trying to figure out like what do I want to do because I'm going through all these different careers. Like I had 3 different jobs because the third job that I got after the cruise line was the job that I had the longest. It's the job I had the longest in my whole life. Even now, like in terms of working for one specific company because I've been teaching for longer now I think than I did that. But for working for one specific place, I was there longer than any other place. But so I was like doing a lot of writing and stuff. And so I was trying to figure out like, what do I want to do basically? So I feel like in the 10th house way, this year was more like a year of like travel and explanation or exploration, not explanation, travel and exploration about where am I going? Like with the chariot year, it's like, where am I headed? Because I keep going from like job to job, and none of these jobs have any like particular meaning to me, right? They were all just jobs to make money so that I could live. And this was like the thing that I really want to do is I want to write. I love writing. I love these ideas. Like I love things like the Phantom or like Hades and Persephone and like all these kinds of things. Right? Next time that I did 10th house perfection year was 2020, which obviously there were a lot of things that happened in 2020 for me personally and like worldwide. This was like a big year. This was also in terms of the tarot card, which like I haven't talked about, I think, a lot in the other episodes, but this one I think was like interesting for me. And when I started becoming more aware of the tarot card years, this
Mm,
was a wheel year for me, a 10th house wheel year.
mm,
And it was very like the fates kind of thing in terms of the actual like events that were happening around me, but also what was happening in my own life related to those events. Because at this point in time, I was living at home with my parents. That's how I started off the year, is I had just bought a new car, like the day before like New Year's or whatever. I was going to a bunch of hockey games with my friends. I had spent the whole last year reading a bunch of romance novels, and now I wrote 3 romance novels, which I like published on Kindle. And they're not anything, they aren't like popular or anything like that. It's just like it was like a way for me to do something that like I wasn't seeing in the romance novels I was reading that I really wanted. And so I was like publishing these things and I was really having a fun time just writing. Like I really felt good about it. So regardless of how successful it was, I didn't really care like really much about these. It was more just a way to be able to do writing, which I hadn't done in a really long time, and writing that was like fun for me. Because for a really long time, the only kind of writing that I did do was academic writing. Everything was about like writing essays and things like that. Whereas this was like, I just want to write something that's fun. I just want to write something that's I just enjoy and that would just be enjoyable. So I was doing a lot of that. I was adjuncting at a college. I was working at the place where I did the captioning and all that kind of stuff. So that's all that was happening at the beginning of the year, right? This is like the start of the year. The start of the year is also when I got the email from my college because I had already applied the previous year. In my 9th house perfection year, I had first applied to this college and I didn't get the job. I came in second. And they told me that. They were like, if we could have had 2 people that we hired, we would have hired you too. The only reason I got beat out was because the other professor had a PhD and I only had a master's degree. But they were like, we really loved your like presentation, all that stuff. But please apply again if we have another opening. And I didn't have to look to see if they were applying. I had actually made the decision. I was like, I'm not going to apply to any more jobs. You know what? I'm fine staying in Boise. I literally just made this decision that I was like, I'm not going to apply to jobs anymore. I'm tired of doing this. I'm actually just going to stay in Boise and live here. And for the time being, I didn't intend to stay forever, but it was like, for now, I'm just going to stay at least for another year. And I'm going to pay off my debt and do all this stuff. That was my mindset. And they reached out to me. So this felt very much like the kind of like wheel sort of thing that was happening because I did not apply to this job. They reached out to me and said, "Hey, we're hiring again. Please apply." And
Ooh,
so I
because of
went,
your reputation, because you already showed them what you
mhm,
could do and what you have
yeah.
been doing.
And so I went knowing I was going to get hired because I was like, why would they? Because they paid both times for me to have a hotel. They paid for my car, my flight, or all this stuff to get me down there. And I was like, they're not going to pay for this if they don't think they're definitely probably going to hire me.
Right.
Right. So I went into it like pretty confident. And I went in and I still tried, I gave it my all. I gave a really good presentation. I asked different questions. I went back over and looked at, I'm pretty good at applying for jobs I want. So I did the research and I was like, oh, here's initiatives that they're
Virgo.
doing. And here's, yeah, I did my research on the actual thing that you're supposed to do. I chose a different like teaching presentation to do because I was like, I want to show them that I have other things that I can do and all this stuff, right? So and they like one of the professors told me I was writing down notes because this thing that you presented on, it's like working perfectly with an assignment I've been trying to do. So it was like great. I felt great
That's
about it
awesome.
and I got hired. But the job, like this time, the first time I had interviewed the year before, the interview happened in March. This time it happened in January. So I knew I wasn't even going to start this job until September. So it was like quite a big gap, right, of getting the job. Academic jobs are weird, right? Like
Yeah.
the resume process, the application, but I have to go through so many interviews and so many like the interview lasts all day. Both times I did this, like the interview was several hours
Wow.
long, where it was like I met with multiple different people. I had to meet with the president and the vice president. I had to give a teaching presentation. I had to do multiple, like I did a phone interview first and then I did this. It's a long process. And then, of course, because they do the hiring at the beginning of the year, but the jobs all start during the academic year, there's like a gap. It's not like a regular job where you're like, oh, I need to be available in 2 weeks. So I had some time to kill. I knew that. Like at the beginning of the year, it was like, okay, I'm going to be here at least for the next 8 or 9 months. So I was still in Idaho for a while. And then, of course, it's like February. I'm going to these hockey games all the time with, I'm like, this is my year,
February
man. I got
2020.
it. I
Bum,
got a
bum,
new
bum.
car. I'm getting a new job at the end of this year. I'm hanging out with my friends. I'm going to these hockey games. I was like, this is great. This is my year. And then I remember us going to these hockey games. We were going regularly. Sometimes I'd go 1 or 2 times a week or something with me and my friend or my friends. Like there were two people that I would like go with. And I was having a blast. And I remember we started to hear about COVID and it was like, oh, this is like a thing. We might want to stop going to the hockey games for a bit until this dies over. That was like our thinking, right? We're gonna like going
Yeah.
for a couple of weeks until this goes away because I was living with my parents and my parents are like older and I didn't want to risk getting them sick. One of my friends was also living with his parents at the time because he had also just recently moved back to Idaho temporarily. His dad was actually really ill. And so they went on real lockdown when this
Mm,
happened. And so we stopped going. And I remember I was working still, I was going to classes, and then we went on spring break. And at the time I was on the semester system because in Idaho they're doing semesters. Most of the time I've been on quarter system. So it's a little different. Quarter system, spring break is the end of the quarter, and you're going to start a new quarter when you come back. Semester system is it's partway through the quarter and you're coming back to the same class after
mm,
this week, right? And so I remember we went on spring break and then we got this notification in the college and they're like, we're going to extend spring break by a week. Right. So that was the first thing that happened, the first set of emails. And then it was like, we got another set of emails and it was like, no, we're not going to come back. All the classes are going to be online. And I had never
oh
taught
my
online
gosh.
before this part. Like I've only ever
Wow.
taught on person. And the way that the college that I was at the time worked was if you wanted to teach online classes, you had to go through this training that the college did to be able to teach online because it is very different to teach online than to teach in person. And so I was in the middle of doing that training, but I had not completed it yet. And I had never done this before. And it was just like, oh man. So I was just having to finish out the last 2 weeks of this term, just, okay, we're not coming back. So here are your assignments to do. And I basically was just
Yeah.
like,
Wow.
with what's happening, don't worry about like the individual due dates. I was like, these are the things you need to turn into me by the end of the quarter, to get your grade in the class. Like, just do it when you can, because it was very like, this was very new. Like, we didn't know like what was happening. We didn't know how long it was going to last. And also at my other job where I was doing the captioning, that was like all the phone calls that I'm listening in on are like people talking about this and like political stuff and like all this stuff. So it was a rough summer because I went from really kind of going out all the time in like the late winter, early spring, right? Like hanging out, going to these hockey games, going downtown, doing writing, like all this stuff to just kind of, I was only at my parents' house. I would go on these long drives around town because it was like,
Mm-hmm.
like I don't know what to do with myself. Basically, at that point, all I was doing was killing time until I moved. And I was also talking to my friends about like it's going to suck as a place where I know no one. Because when I moved to Washington, I was moving for a guy. And even when I moved to California, again, I was moving for relationships. But this is like, I knew no one. Everybody was going to be at least 7 hours away from me. And so my friend like ended up saying that he would go with me in part so that he could get out of his parents' house and be closer to his partner. They lived in Oregon. September like rolls around, September 1st. That's when I did the move. But this was the worst move of my life. The worst time I had this first 3 months. I moved 9 times. I could not find a place to live. I tried buying a house before I left. I couldn't get a deal on. I wasn't able to make that happen. I put an offer in on a house, which it turns out it's a good thing that that didn't work out because moving to California would have been a lot harder if I owned a house, right? So
Yeah.
we booked an Airbnb for a month and a half initially. So from the first month and a half, we lived in the basement of this person's Airbnb. This train was going by all the time, waking us up in night. And I was trying to find a rental the whole time. But COVID's full swing by this point. It's like fall of 2020. I had to leave my dog at my parents' house. I had to go back and forth between Boise at least 4 or 5 times, like driving 7 hours to Boise for a weekend. Like I'd leave Friday after work and then like have to leave on Sunday to go drive 7 hours back. And I'd bring my stuff over, like over multiple trips. But it wasn't until the final trip I was able to bring Snoopy. So for a long time I was without my dog, which sucked. We were going back and forth between Boise and Oregon. And then by the time the Airbnb thing was up, we still didn't have a place. And I tried to extend it and they were like, no, we have somebody else coming in, so you can't stay. So then started the worst period of time. So I was already midway through this first quarter at a new job, right? First quarter, new job, trying to learn all these things. All my classes are like, I have to mask up or they're online. All our meetings are happening on Zoom. Everything's very chaotic. And now I don't even necessarily have a place to live. And so then we had to start doing sometimes, every 4 days to a week, we would move hotels. And we started off because we didn't have a lot of money and staying in hotels is expensive. So I'll say this, we were
Yeah.
staying in Motel 6 for a while, which is the cheapest hotel we could get, right? The cheapest hotel room, because we're going to say that's $2,000 a month. That's like more than like my rent was,
Wow.
because eventually the place I got to rent was $1,000 a month, which is cheaper than anywhere. The only reason I was able to pay rent that cheap was because of the location, but it was expensive. And to live in a place that we didn't have a microwave, we didn't have a fridge in that room. We had to eat nothing but takeout. It was me and my friends. And it wasn't like he was a partner or anything, that we're staying in the same room in two beds. I had no privacy. I was going crazy. It was like 9 times, I think, before. And so it was like we moved September 1st. We finally got our place that I ended up renting the whole rest of the time that I lived in Oregon after Thanksgiving. That was when I
Mm.
finally had a place. It was right after I came back the last time from my parents' house. I went and I got Snoopy. We brought him back and it had been just after Thanksgiving. And so finally I had a place. So that was like the big like relief, right? So the other thing is that year, the only other big thing that happened was that year was the year that I met my girlfriend. We met online. So we met on a Discord server about a shared interest of ours. We had went from being just acquaintances on this server, and then we became just like really close friends. Like we were best friends for a while before we became girlfriends. But so I met her. And so the wheel years sometimes can do that, because I also met like my childhood best friend who I'm still best friends with during a wheel year. And so I feel like wheel years sometimes are like when I'll make like really important like connections with people or like places or things like that. So this was like for sure a big year related to 10th house, because it was basically the culmination of when I had gone back to community college all those years ago and then gotten my associates and my bachelor's and my master's degree, and the whole time just working towards I want to be a professor at a community college. And so this was one step in the culmination of this. Like it was
Mm-hmm.
a couple years after that that I like signed the contract where I was no longer like on probation, and that was when I like considered that 12-year cycle to have like fully completed. But
Mm-hmm.
this was like the culmination career wise of I achieved the thing. And I did it, like it was very lucky. It's very hard to get a
Mm-hmm.
full-time professor job in my field. And so it's a very difficult thing to do. Some people are adjuncts just like forever. And so it was very much like a big like achievement for me, like the thing of me being like, yeah, I made it. I did the thing that like I was supposed to do. And I was able to like, this was also like me moving was me and my dad hadn't been speaking for a while. And I started speaking to him again. Like I went over to his house to show him my new car and to tell him I got this job and to tell him that I was moving. And so to get that again, that validation from my dad about, see, like I'm doing my career thing. I did the thing I said I was going to do. I made it. Like
Mm-hmm.
I achieved this thing or whatever. And yeah, so that was like a big year for me, like career wise, that 10th house year. It was a big, like, culminating thing. So yeah,
I
that's all
like the
my.
culmination term because it's you get to the highest point, right? Like you've
Mm-hmm.
made it to the top of the chart, and it's not that things are just downhill from there,
Mm-hmm.
but it is this climax point where it's everything is
Although
building
it was
up to this point.
a little bit downhill from,
I
I
mean,
feel like it was like, and because it was a wheel
yeah,
year, right? So I feel like at this point I was
right.
at like the 12th point on the wheel. And what ended up happening for me was while I was teaching at grad school, while I was teaching in Idaho, I really loved teaching. I was really into it. I really loved it. I loved working with my students, all that stuff. This, and maybe because of the way things started off with the moving and the like, all of this like chaos and stuff that was me being really isolated in this town, all I had was work and home life. I had no friends. I was either at work. And at one point I was sleeping at work. I would go to my office and I would take naps because like I couldn't sleep in the hotel room all the time because it was too noisy. But like I was like I think I was like really stressed and depressed and had a lot going on mentally. And I didn't have any distraction from that. It was just, I was at work and then I was at home by myself. I was at work and then I was at home by myself. And I started to not love teaching as much. This was the downfall. For the whole time that I was full time there, I loved teaching less and less and I felt worse and worse at my job. Not bad ever. Like, I don't think I was a bad professor, that I was like not doing what I needed to do, but like I felt like I put less and less effort into trying new things or like really going out of my way to do stuff for my job or whatever. It was like I put the bare minimum effort I could into what I thought my students needed. Like I wanted to give them at least what I thought that they had to get, but I had no energy. And this is like the start of my health problems and like all this kind of stuff. I felt like being there, and I don't know, maybe sometime we should do an episode on astrocartography. I don't know if there is
Mm,
something about that location that for me
mm-hmm.
specifically was difficult, or if it was just the isolation, because I loved my colleagues. I'll say that I loved working at this college, and I still do technically just from like remotely, but like
Mm-hmm.
I loved working there and I loved my colleagues. Like I really got a lot of support professionally from my colleagues and a lot of support in terms of being able to be paid to go to conferences and do all this kind of stuff. I loved it, but I felt so unhappy the whole time I was there that it just started to eat away at like what I felt like I was able to do or like the energy I was able to give to my job. And then now I feel like actually I've started just recently over the last few quarters getting back into it in a way that's, oh, I want to try this. And it worked really well and it made me really excited and it made me put more into it again. And so I feel like I'm maybe back on the like, maybe it like kept going down and then now it's like so on the it was like on the upswing again or something. But it was
Yeah.
like it definitely when you said that, it was like,
The
oh yeah, you're at the
waxing.
when you said that, it's like the culmination. And then it was like, oh, like now you've reached, because it felt almost, oh hey, I reached this pinnacle point in my career. I reached what I wanted. And now do I really want this anymore? There was a lot of questioning of that about what I wanted to do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good example, too, of this push and pull dynamic between the fourth house and the 10th house. Like, you have to have a
Mm-hmm.
stable foundation, literally, right? Like, you
Mm-hmm.
were living in a hotel, motel, all these different
Mm-hmm.
places. To not feel stable in your foundation in your fourth house can play a
Mm-hmm.
huge part in your 10th house, like how you show up in your career life in this
Mm-hmm.
instance. And the fact that your MC is in the 11th house of like groups of people or like that niche
Mm-hmm.
group of say like academic people, you really loved your colleagues, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like you found more purpose and more support with your MC in the 11th house for the people in the groups that you're working with there,
Mm-hmm.
right? You were motivated to keep showing up for your students when you're unmotivated in just your career. You were
Mm-hmm.
motivated to show up for your colleagues when you don't really want to do the actual 10th house work type deal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good example of the how the houses will play on each other. And then also with your moon in the ninth, not feeling emotionally invested anymore because at that point you had not really been publishing. Ninth house is like
Mm-hmm.
publishing too, right? You're not really working on your side writing skills
Mm-hmm.
because the ninth house can do with publishing, but the 10th house for you is ruled by Mercury. So it was
Mm-hmm.
really heavy up to that point, learning, writing, teaching. And the writing part, the publishing part was the part that like that puzzle got left off, which is really important for your
Mm-hmm.
moon and your emotional security. And so all these things just are
Yeah, not doing
playing
my
off each
own
other.
work even. Because I remember at one point, one of the things I was thinking about doing was going back to grad school because I thought at
Mm,
least there, like I understand my place there. Like I get to do work that's interesting to me. Because one thing is that I teach the really low level classes. So people who are just getting started with college writing. So like the papers are like, that's like the level of papers that I'm grading. And it's like I'm there to help them. But
mhm,
like for me to have my own interest stoked in terms of what I'm reading or the work that I'm doing, I think sometimes I missed that. Like I wanted to write an essay or have a conversation with other people who are just as invested in the topic as I was, where we had all read the
mhm,
same books and we're at the same level of education in terms of we all could talk about the things in the same way. It's a very particular discourse community where it was like we all knew the same terms, we all knew the same like books and had this background together or whatever.
yeah.
So we could have these really interesting, engaging conversations. And I think that really lacked for me at that point because especially initially because I didn't get to spend a lot of time with my colleagues other than like
Right.
because of COVID for the
Mhm.
first like couple of years. And so I think that I missed that. And now is like I've been starting to try to get back into writing again because of that. Because I was like, I think one piece that's missing for me is the part that's my intellectual engagement in my job. I thought it was easier if I have the same class every time, it's easier to teach, right? Because I always know what the assignments are and how to expect it. But I got bored with that.
Right.
And I had more engagement and interest when I changed up the assignments. Because the thing I like to do, and maybe this is very Virgo of me too, the thing that I like best about my job is either teaching in person, which maybe that's the MC in Libra. I love teaching in person a lot more than
Mhm.
teaching online because I like engaging with my students a lot. I like it when I have Zoom meetings with my students and we can actually talk about this now. But the Virgo-y thing I think that I like to do is I like to make the class. I like to be
Mhm.
scaffolding it and being like, okay, how do I teach them how to write a paper and breaking that down into all of the steps of the thesis statement, the body paragraphs, the like source work, like all this stuff, and being like, what's the correct order to teach these things and then how do you build this skill into a stronger skill or whatever. I love doing that. I love researching the best ways to do that. I love setting up the class and organizing it and making it. That part is great. And that's my favorite part about teaching online for sure, is setting the class up initially and being like, ooh, like new assignments or whatever. So I think for me, the intellectual engagement piece for like my moon and then the social engagement piece of like my MC, right? If I don't have those parts met also can sometimes affect the way that like I view my job. And also why maybe my other jobs I didn't like and couldn't put any effort into other than social work. That was the only other job that I ever cared about was when I was a social worker because there was no higher purpose. And I feel like Virgo also is
Yeah.
maybe like a kind of a more I want to have some kind of doing that's not just
Work on a purpose. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, like I don't want to just go to work and, get a paycheck or whatever so that I can do my head. Like I know that, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with that if people, that's what they want to do
Mhm.
because they're, maybe their hobbies are their big thing and that's whatever. For me, though, it was like, if I'm going to spend all this time here and do this thing, if I don't care about my job, if it's just like a thing like that's mindless, like non-engagement, I cannot care enough about it to do it. Like all the jobs I ever had that were just like regular jobs, like my processing job, I hated it. Like I was just standing there all day typing up orders and it was like, I don't care. I don't care
Yeah.
about this at all. And not because I don't care that the person gets their order correct or anything like that, but it's like, it doesn't matter to me personally. There's nothing significant that I'm doing that's making any difference. But social work and teaching, I cared about those jobs because I knew that what I did made a difference to somebody else. If I did a
Right.
good job or a bad job at my job, that was important. That was going to make a difference to like how other people's lives were going to be. And so that gave me a kind of like incentive, like an internal incentive, I think, to be like, this matters and I have to show up. I have to show up and I have to do a good job.
Yeah, that's a really good point for Virgo. Any Virgo placements, especially in the 10th house, is very work with a purpose. You're like impact driven. I'm only going to put in the work building these tiny things, right? The details, right? The details of creating a course or how to teach this topic. I can only put in those details knowing that this work this time intensive labor is going to pay off and have an impact in some aspect
It
of my life.
matters that
Yeah,
my
it
job
matters.
matters. I
Yeah.
want to feel like my job matters. And maybe also like with like my Leo moon, my identity, like we talked about this in another episode, I think my identity was very wrapped up in being an English major and in being a professor. Like how they say, you're not your job. And that's true.
Your Mercury is in the first, so it is very wrapped up in
Yeah.
that.
So I feel like that might be true for some people. You're not your job. It doesn't matter. I don't think it matters if people have a higher education specifically, or that they have a like white collar job or a blue collar. I don't think any of that matters. I think you should do whatever works best for you and whatever makes you happy. The way I care about education is more like critical thinking. If you can get that on your own, like if you do Coursera or videos to learn stuff that's interesting to you, I think that's just as interesting and valid. It's not so much the certificate or like that stuff that like I think matters. But I think for me, it was very much wrapped in and still is wrapped up in who I am. Like my job, like me being a professor is like my identity. That is very important to me. And that's how I like think about myself largely. Not my whole identity. There's other parts, obviously, but that's a huge part about how I feel I show up in the world, or like what I feel I like bring to things. So
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, the landscapers are here now. So I'm like, oh, I'll probably hear that in the background. Just gonna mute real fast. Okay. For my 10th house perfection years, we were talking about it because like you've known me for a lot of this time. And for age 21, I have to confirm the dates and stuff, but I feel like it was around the time when I started my own soap making and toiletry business. It would have been the first time I went on my own in this entrepreneurial path, even though it was still a side hustle at that point. But it was like the first time I put myself out there in the public eye to be like, no, I want to be my own boss. I want to do my own thing and be a business owner. It feels fitting for the 10th house. I just hope that the years match up nicely. And then, yeah, 2020. So, a 2019, which would have been my ninth house, which does have my MC. So it falls back on that mission and the Aries and the Mars there to be my own boss, is when I ended up quitting my 9 to 5 and really decided to go all in on my own business, which at the time was centered around dogs. And I was doing in person vending events. So I was selling at markets and all this stuff. So 2019, I was like, I'm finally at the point where I made like, I think $15,000 the first year on the side of my 9 to 5. And so I'm like, I'm finally at the point where if I just scale up a little bit this year, I'm comfortable enough to leave my job. So at the end of 2019, I leave my job to do this in-person selling stuff and all the blog and stuff that went along with that. And then 2020 was like, yeah, let's do this. And right before the markets start, because we don't have markets in Washington in the winter because it's too cold. So right before market season starts in the spring, we hit lockdown. And I'm like, cool. I just like quit my job to do this thing that now I can't do anymore in the same way. So 2020 was about me really trying to stick to this mission of being my own boss, doing my own thing, but in a way that, like, how can I show up in the world to be my authentic self in this way when the world is shut down? So it was a lot of, now we're going to learn how to sell online via social selling, like going live on Instagram and Facebook and stuff and trying to sell that way. And it was like, dabbling in all these different things, and I started my own like live show on my Facebook page, and it was like this weekly thing which ended up moving into what else can I teach, what else can I do, which is interesting because for a few months there, I really almost went all in on being a simplicity coach, which is funny going back to that Taurus energy, because my mentor at the time told me that because I had decluttered my life and got myself down into like RV living, that I'd be really good teaching other people how to declutter their life. And it was like declutter possessions and mindset and digital decluttering, like everything to start simple in your life. And so I was like, oh, I felt like I was being talked into that. And I was like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that'll work. I can do that. But then my heart wasn't in it again. And so
Right.
I like had to switch. But that moved into my first podcast. So I went back to this like personal development and mental health type podcast. And then by the end of, I think it went a little bit into the next year, but when that started wrapping up, I was like, I need a solid focus. I need a niche. I need some sort of expertise, which eventually led me to I need to study astrology. And going into the 11th house year of like affiliations and groups, I think astrology also fits into the 11th house with the like correlation with Aquarius and stuff, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But this was like a precursor to starting the astrology thing
Mm-hmm.
on my own and self studies. So it's bringing in the ninth house of self studies, it's bringing in the 10th house of public, what I want to be known for. And then, so I don't know,
And
it's
it's all
really,
the stuff that kind of culminates in what you're doing now to some extent. It's like the
mm-hmm.
precursor. Not that this is like the culmination, but like that it's like kind of this now we're doing a podcast. You're like a coach in the sense of with like astrology and stuff like that, or speaking on astrology. We're doing like the course on the like workshop. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
almost here are all the like little skills that you have to like work on or get or dive into before you can get to the thing that you're actually going to do them with. So,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was my first dabble in course creation that year because I made this like little master class called From Clutter to Calm. It was my first encounter with how to set up an online course and how to teach an online course and all the skills that obviously I'm going to need for entrepreneurship. It was just directed in a niche, a different manner. That's all I have for the 10th house. It's just really interesting that simplicity thing came into play and then adding in my MC from the ninth house. Okay, let's go and take a look at Simone Biles' chart. This is her chart. She is a Pisces rising with a nice, beautiful stellium in Pisces. We have Venus, Sun, Mercury, and South Node all in Pisces, and her that makes her 10th house Sagittarius, where she has Pluto and the MC and the part or lot of fortune. It's a Jupiter ruled 10th house, and Jupiter is hanging out behind the scenes in the 12th house. So I feel like she's had a lot of luck in the area of her public career, but it might not have always been public luck. She's had a lot of blessings in her connections and stuff, but they've all kind of been behind the scenes with different coaches and stuff. I just recently watched her show on Prime about some of the aspects of her life. So, like, she had this ends with a really prestigious gymnastics coach that works with the Olympic team. That was all like happening behind the scenes and stuff. But a Jupiter in the 10th house or Jupiter ruling the 10th house, I feel like can bring a lot of luck in connecting people that'll help you with your 10th house or having a lot of opportunities to advance in your career or your public life. Obviously, she's going to be known for, and she's making a legacy in the gymnastics world, in the sports world.
mm-hmm.
Jupiter there can also really need that belief in the work that she's doing. Like also needs that higher meaning because Sag is about like the bigger picture. So I think when she feels that she's not connected to her work in that way, that it's harder to continue, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that's why we had her kind of step away in 2020 from the Olympics. It was sad because I watched her documentary or whatever you want to call it, but it stopped at 2016. The ending, to no spoilers, but the ending was like her writing in her vision journal on to 2020 Olympics or something. And I'm like, wait,
Mm-hmm.
I want to know about what happened in 2020. But
And the 2020 Olympics were like a pretty big deal for her because that was like the 2020 Olympics were the ones where she had to step away from one of the events, I think. I forget. But because she had the twisties, or she felt her mental health was not in a place where she was able to like safely complete her routine. And that was like a big deal because people were very divided on, oh, did you like let the team down? Or people being like, no, that's great because she's showing that like mental health is important and you shouldn't push yourself. So I think that, and like her Jupiter being in the 12th house, which
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of like mental health stuff that you can potentially look at there too. And her eighth house, Libra, ruled by Venus, her Venus is in her first house. That's one of the things that I feel like she's known for at this point. Like she's known for this step away and then now known for coming back to it and just dominating. It wasn't like she took that step away from it and didn't come through. She like came back and just dominated at the Olympics this next time that she showed up. So,
Yeah, so in 2020, she would have been 23, which is a 12th house perfection year. So,
mhm,
really going back on that idea of the importance, right? And
mhm,
Jupiter, the expansion of topics that are not necessarily talked about openly. So, we've got that hidden
mhm,
factor of the 12th house bringing in the stigma behind mental health.
mhm,
And with Uranus there, it's made public in a very shocking and an instantaneous manner. Like it's not like she hasn't been dealing with these mental health issues behind the scenes, right? Obviously
mhm,
she has, but now it's bringing in the 10th house because the Jupiter is activated ruling the 10th house that year.
mhm.
And Uranus is like, no, we need to talk about this right now. Like in the middle of the Olympics, we need to stop
Mhm.
everything and be like, no, this is affecting my performance in the 10th house, ultimately my reputation, my legacy, and what I want to be
Mhm.
known for. And we need to talk about this. We need to stop it. We need to do whatever we need to do, right? So
Mhm.
that's really interesting. And then she's 27 this year, which puts her in a fourth house year. So opposite her 10th house of career, which is also brings up this idea that she's working on her foundations. She's working on her, with her moon there, maybe her emotional security or what makes her
Mhm.
feel safe on a fundamental or a foundational level to be able to perform in this
Mhm.
in the limelight basically in her 10th house.
Mhm.
And of course, she has her part of fortune in the 10th house too, which we haven't really talked about parts a lot, but it's a very lucky area. If you think of part of fortune,
Mhm.
it just sounds lucky, right? It's a very lucky area in her life. So she's had all these opportunities and doubled down on the luck with Jupiter's influence and the part of fortune influence to be able to Pluto transform her career, continually evolve in her career to
Mhm.
show up in this way.
And to be able to have it for like longevity. Most gymnasts are not as old
Yeah.
as her and still competing at the Olympics. Like I remember my cousin and a lot of the gymnasts too, I'll say a lot of the gymnasts here and my cousin also are all like Pisces placements, right? So I don't know if
Hmm.
there's something related to like gymnasts and Pisces, like, but like
Fluidity
there were
and
like, yeah,
motion.
there were like a lot of like Pisces at the gymnastics. But
Hmm.
I remember like with my cousin, like this idea of like they're peaking at 18, 19, 20 or something like that, maybe 22. And she's so
Mm-hmm.
much older than these other gymnasts, which is great because she's had all this time to continue to perfect things and get even better. But part of the reason they're even able to do that now is because before they had these coaches who were not good. They were very controlling. They were very concerned
Mm.
with the weight of the gymnasts. Like they used to have to be much thinner and like there was a lot of eating disorders and stuff. There was the whole thing with the
Mm.
doctor who was like sexually assaulting a lot of these gymnasts that they all had to come forward about. And so now, from what I understand at least, this environment that they're doing this stuff in is a lot healthier and better. And because they've come out and talked about that, so they're able to potentially go for longer. Like I feel like part of the reason that she's able to like have this longevity is that the environment around just gymnastics has significantly changed
Mm.
in the last few years. And I feel also the Jupiterian thing, when we're talking about expansion, she's expanded the repertoire of gymnastics because she has
Mm.
developed I think now it's 6 new moves that are named after her that weren't a thing before, and that they had to expand the way that they score
Mm-hmm.
her because her difficulty level was outside of what the other gymnasts are doing. Because I think the way that it works with like the scoring is that like the more difficult of a performance you're doing, you have a little bit of leeway to make some mistakes or to not be like absolutely
Mm-hmm.
perfect because you're already starting off at such a high bar compared to everyone else. And that's where she's at. She pushed the boundaries, which is very Jupiterian. She's pushed the boundaries
Mm-hmm.
of what gymnastics is and what gymnastics does, like what gymnasts are able to do. And I think been a star that's probably gotten a lot of other gymnasts like really inspired, and probably particularly gymnasts of color or like Black gymnasts. If I think back on what I remember the gymnastics teams looking like earlier, I think that they were like a lot more white, more thin, and this very
Mm-hmm.
particular kind of person. So I think that not always obvious there were like Dominique Dawes and stuff like that, but I just mean I feel like she is now seen as she is the star of gymnastics. Everybody knows she's the GOAT, she's the best, she's probably the best there ever was in the whole history of the sport at this point. And that feels very Jupiterian, expansive, like that you're known in your career as being the person who pushed the boundaries and like, are the
Transformed with
star.
Pluto.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also love that you brought up like BIPOC and traditionally underrepresented peoples in this field, in this aspect, because Sag there, right? We have
Mm-hmm.
this expansion of the foreign or the other person. And also with just the fact that she's gone so far in the sport that you're doing Olympics, Sag to me is like going to foreign lands to be
Right.
not only recognized in another country for what you
Mm-hmm.
do, but you're traveling, you're doing this abroad, like you're
She's
away from
known
home.
worldwide. The Olympics is a competition, right?
Yeah.
Even if she were to come to like LA, right, which is not the next time we have the Summer Olympics, right? It's that's still all these countries, different countries coming together to compete, right? And so it's very much being known in the world for this thing, not just like in one specific like niche group, but like worldwide that she's recognized as like great persons.
Yeah. And we have that connection also because Jupiter is also her chart ruler because Pisces ruler is Jupiter. And so it's really bringing in this not only highlight of her skills and her public reputation, but the highlight of her as a person. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about her mental health, her skills, her transformation on the sport in general.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of retrograde planets in our chart. I'm like, why are there so many?
Oh, that's an interesting thing. So, when you think about retrogrades, you think about the redoing or the going back for other attempts, right? So, we had this incident in 2020 where she stepped away. We
Mm-hmm.
had this opportunity to return, to reinstate her name into the sport or to reattempt the actions she tried to do into I don't know if her routines are the same. This idea of being able to return and edit what you're doing.
And
Um,
also interesting because in 2020, the transits that were happening was the North Node was in Gemini and the South Node was in Sagittarius.
mm,
So the South Node, the stuff that is like her 10th, the South Node was in her 10th house, which is like the stuff that like I feel like it
you're
was like more
stepping away
yeah,
from.
stepping away from it, going to her moon, which is like mental health, right? Like towards that
Yeah,
as like a thing. Whereas right now they're in Aries and Libra,
Aries and
right?
Libra.
Because we're
Yeah.
having like our like it's like nodal return or whatever, because they're in
Yep.
the like but yeah, as though like it would be now like eighth and second. So yeah, so in her second house next to her.
So activating that Saturn, that hard work, that all the years she's put
Mm-hmm.
in and devoted to this sport are now being highlighted because all her skills, we got second houses like skills and your resources, like the
Mm-hmm.
people you've known through this career are now helping you because the
Mm-hmm.
second house is trine the 10th house, right? So they're in a
Mm-hmm.
mutual aid to one another. So the
Mm-hmm.
hard work Saturn and the North Node being there is helping Saturn show up in the 10th house, helping her
Mm-hmm.
really know that I've put in so many years for this sport. we now need to show the world what I can do. You said something last time when we briefly talked about this chart about her partner. So
Oh
is
yeah.
she married or dating a
She's
football player?
married. And so she's married to a football player. And so the thing that happened, like with this guy that she's married to, let's see what he said, because it was like, so Olympic gold medalist Simone Biles' husband, Jonathan Owens, claims he is the catch, quote unquote, and the better athlete in their relationship.
Mm,
So this was like a big, like people were like, a
I
lot of people
mean,
call
come
him
on.
Simone Biles' husband, right? He's like a football player, but it's like, are you the greatest football player of all time? Or what is the, so like a
Yeah,
lot of people really were like upset about that, like on her behalf, basically, where they were like,
right.
this is like a really shitty thing for him to have said, like all this stuff. And so they were, I think, a little bit antagonistic towards that relationship. Like the public perception of their relationship was very much, I don't know, he's right for you, he appreciates you enough, right? Because like, why
Yeah,
would you say that about Simone Biles, right? You should be like, so people call him like Simone Biles' husband, right? Instead of his
yeah, that's
name.
funny.
Because who is this
So,
guy?
yeah, and you are.
But
So we
then,
have Mars in the seventh house, right? And Mars is competition. And
mhm,
it's the seventh house, like we talked about, is always going to square the 10th house. So it's like
mhm,
this competition showing up in competition in careers. Are you better?
mhm.
Are I better? Who's at the pinnacle of our career right now? Type topic.
Yeah. And then, so at this Olympics, he took time off of the training camp. He had that in his contract, right? That he was going to take time out of like training for football to go to the Olympics to support
Mm,
her, which of course. But there was this whole thing about everybody was saying like, oh, it's so cute because they saw him like in the stands and he'd be taking notes, I think on the scoring or something. Like he was
mm,
very like invested. You could tell he was very focused and invested on what's happening like with her, like during her performance. And so then everybody liked him again and was like, oh, yeah, that's really cute, like whatever. But then she was having like everyone like, so this is the picture that came out. This isn't necessarily like the full context, I guess, but like the picture that came out was he was trying on her Olympic medal, and everybody
mm,
was like, you shouldn't be wearing that. Like, you don't deserve to wear this medal, blah, blah, like all this stuff on social media, on TikTok, all this stuff. And she actually, I saw her respond to one of the creators that said this. Like Simone Biles on TikTok responded to this creator who was like making this whole video about him doing that. And she was like, something like, y'all are so miserable. Like, we're happy. I also let everybody in my family try on the medal. It wasn't like he just was like taking it from her to show off with it or something. She was like, my mom and whoever was in her family, I think it was her mom, because I think that but I think that she was like mad. I think that like people were talking about them still and talking about them in this way because it was like, and a lot of people like, it's her choice, right? And you need to back off because if she loves him, if she's happy in the relationship, this whole public perception thing.
mm.
So that's like an interesting thing. There's this very definite public perception of her relationship that may be at odds, I think, with like what she views her relationship as or how she is like seeing her relationship. So yeah, that's
Yeah, that is really interesting looking at the chart in those aspects because, first off, you said he was taking notes. He was publicly seen as taking notes.
mhm,
So we have this Virgo influence with the seventh house, right? And Virgo is very detail oriented, note taking, whatever.
mhm,
And then the Mars bringing in this competition, but also aggressiveness. There's been aggression for her partner, but ultimately all reflecting back on her. So the
mhm,
seventh house has the ruler in the first house. So what does it say about her and how she either advocates Mars for her partner or how she deals with the aggression that her partner is now facing?
mhm.
Which is all really interesting to look at. Yeah, I guess that's all I can say about it. I was going to expand more on just her in general, but I think if we just focus on the 10th house. Oh, but Pluto does rule the Chiron in the ninth.
And they were both retrograde, Pluto and her Chiron.
Yeah, that's interesting. The ninth house also being about a place of expansion and feeling Scorpio, this deep intensity around expansion. Like maybe it wasn't just her mental health playing a part in her skill set, it was also this wound playing on how big can I get? Like, how expansive can I get and still be, I don't know. I don't know. There's not a full thought there, but it's interesting that it's bringing in a wound around ninth house Sag stuff. Anyway.
Also, I guess they're doing a second part of the Simone Biles Rising thing. They just announced it.
Oh,
So they're going to do a part two of that.
they're
It
probably
says,
waiting to see what happens with this Olympics.
yeah, yeah. So they saw, yeah, because I think the Olympics is over now. So yeah, they're like a conclusion, a thrilling conclusion to the documentary following the first two episodes, which chronicled the real chaos she felt after a bad vault prompted her to drop out of the Tokyo Olympics and regain her confidence in Paris.
Yeah.
Beyonce made a tribute video to her.
Oh, that's interesting.
Damn, that's oh my God.
That's using your Pluto in the 10th house, your power for what you're known for. Oh, yeah? Does
Mhm.
Beyonce talk about you personally?
Then she got to hang out with Snoop Dogg at the Olympics because Snoop Dogg was like
Oh,
the
I did
unofficial
see that, I
mascot of the
think.
Olympics, and he was at all these different things, like hanging out with Martha Stewart and stuff. Yeah. And she's about to have her Saturn return. I guess she wasn't already at her Saturn return because her Saturn's in Aries and it's still in
Mm.
Pisces, right? But she's close because she's 27, so she's like close to it. She's about to have her Saturn return. So
Yeah, which will be interesting to see if and how it reflects on her career. Is she going to come back next Olympics and continue that, or is she going to evolve to the next stage of life? Saturn usually
hmm
is like a maturation of
hmm
some sort. So like maybe this is just going to be her, if we're talking about second house, right? Maybe this is her like finding new ways to use her resources. So usually after Olympics are successful and stuff, athletes are successful,
hmm
they go on to say like sponsorships
hmm
or what is the word? Like brand deals, stuff like that. So maybe her Saturn return coming up will reflect on how she's using her 10th house fame and legacy in more of a second house way with
hmm
I now support Nike, I like whatever, however that
Even getting the documentary is to some
oh yeah,
extent
totally.
that sort of a thing. And it's interesting because the Olympics are always going to be for her, right, during fourth, eighth, or 12th house years, because they're every 4 years.
Hmm. That
So
is
the
interesting.
next Olympics will be her eighth house perfection year, which I think will be the same. I think is her first Olympics, because was her first Olympics 2016?
I think so.
But so that's an interesting thing because then that would be almost a full circle 12-year cycle from her first Olympics, which is very culmination. If we're like talking about culmination, her having the Olympics again that year is going to be interesting, and it's house of shared resources and stuff, so how and death and like all those other kinds, but not necessarily death literally. And so it'll be interesting, like maybe to see if like her career has a death and rebirth in terms of a new transition, like maybe she becomes a coach or does the like, because I've
Mm,
known a lot of gymnasts who later become coaches or like are involved in other ways in the sport, right? So potentially doing something like that. But also I was looking at this picture of her, which I think is really funny because it just posted, I think recently, like within the last couple days or something, that Netflix posted of her in Paris. And she's drinking
mm.
champagne, but she has this necklace, and the necklace is like a little goat necklace, which obviously is because she's the goat.
Yeah, yeah.
I was like, it looks like I was like, it looks like a little Aries like ram kind of thing. That's what the necklace
Mm.
looks like. And so I was like, that's kind of funny, like with her like Saturn return coming up. Like, that's just, I don't know.
Yeah, super interesting.
To be known as the goat.
Yeah.
Known as the greatest of all time.
Yeah, pretty crazy. Definitely an awesome comeback for sure.
Yeah, I
Comeback.
was watching
Comeback. That's
like
what I wanted to say about retrograde. Retrograde can be like
mm,
comeback, you know?
hmm yeah, like a return, because it's not always, I feel like it's not always like a bad thing. I feel like there's like a fear around retrograde, and maybe we
Oh
should
my
do an
gosh,
episode that
we
talks about
totally
just
do.
retrogrades, right? And different retrogrades for different planets and what that looks like, because I think that a lot of the time the retrograde isn't necessarily bad. It's more revisiting things
Mm-hmm.
like, hey, this is the thing I said I'd do, and then did you or did you not do it? Or let's like return to that kind of thing, depending on where it's showing up, like in your houses, or like how heavily that planet in particular affects you. Like my partner, like one of my partners, he's a Gemini rising Virgo sun. So Mercury retrograde, I feel like probably is a big
Yes.
thing that like affects him heavily, and like his communication or like all that, that's going to matter a lot more to him than maybe somebody who doesn't really have any prominent like Mercury placements. But also like my girlfriend is very Venusian. She's a Libra rising Taurus sun, so both Venus signs. I'm very Jupiterian because I'm Sag rising, Sag sun, and I have my actual Jupiter in Pisces, so in a home sign. So I think that's why I started tracking in my chart, right? The Jupiter, like anything that happens with Jupiter, I look at, and I've noticed like a trend of a lot of my life tends to follow 12-year cycles, or like when Jupiter is in different signs, it affects me more heavily. Like in that sign, like I notice that area of my life a lot more. And so I feel like depending on where you have really strong rulership in a particular like area, then you might notice those retrogrades or that kind of like influence more when things happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So that the retrogrades were around her sensitive points, her angles, right?
Mhm.
And so they're going to show up in the more prominent areas of our lives, us, our home and family, our
Mhm.
relationships, and our public career. I definitely think we need to do an episode on retrogrades. They're feared so heavily and it's driving me bonkers. I used to give sympathy for people that were like, "Oh my god, retrograde." But it's like Mercury goes retrograde 3 to 4 times a year. This is
Mhm.
a consistent thing that we have to deal with. And I appreciate them. Yes, there's things that can go haywire sometimes, but I do appreciate retrograde in the aspects of we have the opportunity to go back
Mhm.
and right wrongs or fix things. And either way, whatever we have to go back and fix during a retrograde was not going to work out anyway.
Mhm.
Eventually down the line we were going to have to go back, so why not take the time set aside to specifically go back and fix something to
And
be
if you're
able to do.
prepared for it, right? I feel like
Mm-hmm.
that's the benefit of astrology, in that if you do care about those things, that you can look at it and go, oh, if I know Mercury is going to be retrograde in this part of my life during this time, maybe I should like Mercury retrograde in Virgo is like my 10th house, or in Leo is my ninth house. And that's where this one like has been in those two houses. And so it's like, how is that? I got to make sure I'm on top of I noticed too, I was caught up all quarter finally. Like I never got behind this quarter with my new system. Everything was great right up until the last couple of weeks. In the last couple of weeks, I started falling majorly behind in my grading and all this stuff. And I've been very stressed out about it, and my communication with my students and stuff. So it definitely showed up for me in that, and in my relationship. Cause like I said, there's a lot of Mercury energy. I just think about it too. And my mom is an Aquarius rising Capricorn sun. I have a lot of people in my life who are very strongly ruled by one
Mm-hmm.
particular thing. My dad has this Leo stellium. I don't know what his rising is, but he's got, I don't know, it was like something like 5 or 6 planets in Leo or something like that. And so I think that if you have a chart like that where you're very focused on one particular thing, then that might be something that can be like really important to look into,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah, we should do an episode on chart rulers because that's
Mhm.
always going to be the most important planet for you in your life and cycles. And then stelliums, because your stellium is in your first house, so it's dealing with Jupiter twice. Some
Mhm.
people might have stelliums in other houses, and the reason those are so important is when we have transits, it's hitting so many different aspects of
Mhm.
yourself because it's hitting so many different planets. It seems more prominent than other areas or other times in your life. But yeah, I think we definitely need to do a chart ruler episode and a retrograde episode and so many things. Let us know
Yeah.
in the comments
Yeah.
what you would like to hear from
If you
us
have
first.
particular questions, if you're like,
And
I
if
want to
you
know
have
more about
questions,
this, and we can do an episode about it.
yes.
Or if you want your chart, if you want us to talk about your chart, you can do it anonymously. So you could send us a chart and be like, hey, tell me about at
Yes.
it. It's hard to, I think that it's a lot easier for me to look at my own chart because I know my life very specifically. So it's like easy for me to make those connections. But then also like we can look at stuff and take guesses or say
There's
what
many
we would see or
possibilities.
what we might know. And we might notice different things too because we approach it differently.
Absolutely. Yeah. Maybe I should make a landing page where people can just drop in some birth information.
Mhm.
Write that down. Okay. Do we have any final thoughts on the 10th house?
The 10th
Sure.
house is your legacy. The 10th house combined with the first house, I feel like is probably like a big chunk of like how people are going to perceive you in different areas of your life, probably too. I'm sure that like people that I work with perceive me more as Virgo than like people that I'm like friends with, maybe. But I think that if you want to see maybe how you're seen by other people, or even maybe to some extent, like what motivates you, like what kind of a mark you want to leave in the world. If you're questioning that, because there are times, like even like right now, like I went through a period of time recently where I was like, I don't know what I want to do. Do I want to keep going with my career? Do I want to go back to grad school? What do I want to do? Thinking about what are the things that I value because I'm in a second house perfection here, right? What are
Yeah.
the things that I really value and how does that maybe show up in my career? How can I have a career that like meets all of my values, that meets my standards, like what I want to do with my life or like how I want to go. But even if like you aren't career focused and you just want to know what do I want to do with my life generally, or what kind of a mark do I want to leave in the world, like maybe looking at your 10th house to be like, or might you be able to help you brainstorm those kinds of things? Like use your second house to brainstorm your values and your 10th house to be like, how can I show those values in the world or put those values to work? So,
Yeah. How can I integrate that into my public facing life for sure? Um, and yeah, it's not always career, right?
mhm,
It's what marks am I leaving on the world? I like the way you
mhm,
put that. What do I want to be known for? What do I want my legacy? What do I want when people hear my name 10, 20, 30, 50, 80? Who knows?
mhm,
Years down the road, what do I want them to think about? Like, when there's a specific way you think about Albert Einstein when you hear his name, right?
mhm.
That's 10th house. What do you want to come to mind? So,
Maybe
uh,
even like future, like if we're looking at the fourth house, right, as like ancestry, like where are you coming from in your family line? 10th house, when we're thinking about like legacy, like what's the opposite end of that? It could also, I think, to some extent be related to like your future, like if you're somebody who has like kids or things like that, right? Your generations coming after you, what do you want to be remembered for in your family,
yes.
or what do you want to pass on to your family? So if you're going to have kids, what kinds of lessons or what kinds of like things do you want to pass on to them to take with them? So,
Yeah, absolutely. So you can think of the chart as a tree, right? So the ICMC or the fourth and 10th, we got the fourth as the roots of the tree. You're coming from where you're getting your nourishment, what feeds the rest of the tree. And the 10th is just the branches that are branching out and touching other people, touching the world around you, maybe producing fruit to therefore give to other people. Like it's this whole system that feeds into it. And so, what fruits do you want your next generations to have? I think is a really cool way to think about it.
yeah. Interesting. Just trying to think about, okay, so what was my mom's 10th house? Like, what, because I don't know my
Mm,
dad's. I was like, so what, like, lessons? So I was like counting backwards to figure out what the sign was. I was like, what lessons? So I guess she has a Scorpio 12th house, or 10th house. That's interesting. I don't really
hmm.
know. I'll have to think on that some more on my own to think about what maybe lessons that might have been, because that would be an interesting exercise to look at our parents, like
Yeah.
just on our own, to look at what do we think that they passed on to us in terms of lessons or like things to move forward with. So,
Scorpio makes me think of like um, emotional intensity and the fact that the way we're talking about being emotionally invested
mm.
in what we're passing on.
And like
Um,
mental health, like I feel like Scorpio is like a mental health kind of like a sign or like stuff that like
mm,
deals with a lot of emotions and stuff. And I think a lot of the conversations that my mom and I have dealt with that. Or a lot of one of the things, and maybe this goes back to Scorpio being Mars ruled and having that severing aspect, is that
mm,
one thing that I did take as a lesson from my mom is that a lot of my friends, either in their own relationships or like with their parents' relationships, there was a lot of those relationships weren't necessarily good, either in really specifically bad ways or just because they weren't like great relationships or whatever. But a lot of people were stayed in those relationships, right? And I had this very strong no, like, why would you stay if you're unhappy? Divorce is okay. Like, you should be able to sever those relationships that aren't making you unhappy. If it's affecting your mental health, if it's making you like, I have a very strong philosophy of doing that because my mom did that, right? She like divorced my dad. And I thought I, throughout my childhood, had this like thing of, oh, I'm so glad my mom divorced my dad. I'm so
Mm,
glad that I don't live with him full time basically because that was stressful enough when I had to go over when I did go over, but it was like and so I saw it as being like a big benefit. And so I always said that to other people too. I was like, oh, if you're thinking of getting divorced because you're gonna do it, like I'll support it. Like I'm totally behind that kind of a thing. But I know a lot of people aren't. There are people who like took a lot from like their that this isn't something you do. You either stay together for the kids or you stay together because this is just what marriage is. And I think a lot of the stuff that we took in the 90s or 2000s of this, there was a lot of unhappy marriages that were like normalized on TV, that it was like
right.
people that were, and that's just what I think a lot of people just think that's just what marriage is. If you're unhappy, it doesn't matter. You made the vow, you like did the, you've got to stay. And I was very much, nah, why would you stay if like you're unhappy, you know,
Yeah.
sever those relationships. And not to say that like I always was able to do that easily in my own life. I certainly stayed in relationships I shouldn't have for like too long and stuff. But my attitude about it was very much like, this is an okay thing to do. And so I think that that kind of comes from that, maybe potentially to that like Scorpio, especially because my Venus is in Scorpio, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. My MC, if we're talking about parents and specifically
Mhm.
mom, my MC is an Aries and she's an Aries, so I have always seen her being very gung ho, very ambitious, very direction oriented. I don't know. She went after what she thought she needed to do, right? She was the breadwinner, so she was constantly working and she was very ambitious in that aspect. And so adding in that flavor of I'm okay if I continue down the path that I want to do because that's what I
Mhm.
feel led to do has can be picked up from that Aries energy. And then Taurus to bring me the finer things in life. No. All right. Anyway, okay. So if you are enjoying our podcast, you can go ahead and leave us a review. Let us know what you think on our11thhouse.com or any of your favorite platforms where you find us, Apple, Spotify, all those good things. And if you're specifically loving our house series, we invite you to join our Artful House series where we will look at your specific house and do an art project around it. So we'll dive into all the meanings that you can glean from your house in your own birth chart. And then we will have some fun time creating beautiful masterpieces around it. Those links will be in the show notes as well as our website at our11thhouse.com. And we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.